Welcome to this edition of the News Review. Britain's Rail and Maritime Union rejects the 4% pay rise proposed by train operators to end the highly disruptive strike action by rail workers. The RMT union says the offer does not meet its criteria for securing long-term job security for its members. Last week, the union said more than 40,000 workers would stage strikes in December and January, signaling major Christmas disruptions. The union also organized major industrial actions that caused massive disruptions in the summer. Britain has witnessed a series of walkouts across different sectors over the past months. The government is now considering using the military's help to fill in for striking workers ahead of key walkouts by nurses and ambulance staff. To discuss that further, we're joined by Robert Carter, our correspondent in London, and also Tony Gosling, historian and journalist, joining us live from Bristol. Let's begin with our correspondent. Robert, give us an update on this most recent strike and, of course, the situation that Britain has been in over the past couple of months. We've been covering news of different industrial action over the past couple of months.
Sure. Well, of course, as you rightly mentioned, there's been many major strike actions taking place this year, and there's already plans being made to continue those actions well into next year as of January. So, of course, there are everything ranging from rail strikes on the horizon, there's postal strikes, strikes regarding the NHS, strikes regarding ambulance drivers, so really important sectors. And what really they're aiming to do is cause significant pressure for the government in the lead up to the Christmas holiday. So that's a time when, of course, packages will be flying up and down the country, letters, as well as a real need for healthcare and different public services. Transport services will be in very much in high demand during that period as well. And of course, this is very unwelcome news for the government, which is trying to convince the general public to basically digest many cuts in public spending and that type of thing. Now, shockingly enough, Government Minister has actually weighed into the row and has basically urged anyone considering going on strike going forward not to do so because it will benefit Putin. So he's tried to make some kind of foreign policy geopolitical statement suggesting that if you go on strike, you're basically helping Putin, which, according to the British government, is a foreign enemy abroad. So this is a comment which was very badly received, caused major condemnation from bosses of several trade unions who accused the government of being basically deeply offensive in using those comments. So the situation seems to be getting worse, not better, and in the days and weeks to come, strike action is still very much on the cards and could escalate well into next year.
Okay, so Mr. Gosling, you just heard the update from our correspondent on the situation on the ground, and basically we've also had news that these workers that are on strike are not agreeing to just any kind of pay rise. In particular, the most recent one of 4% pay rise was not accepted because it did not meet the demands of those workers. Do you believe that the UK government is capable to meet their demands at all?
Well, I think it wouldn't be no problem for them to, and even though many of these sectors have been partially or fully privatised, the government is still in the driving seat when it comes to negotiating. This 4% offer to the rail workers, well, it's really an insult. And, you know, what we're looking at in the UK is between 10 and 15% inflation. The idea is, of course, that the rail workers want to keep their standard of living, so they want a similar pay rise. 4% is nothing like that. And so in a way, the government, what it's trying to do, using the press to bamboozle the public if possible, is to say, well, we've given them an offer, you know, but they've turned it down. And it's fascinating to look at Nadhim Zahawi, the chairman of the Conservative Party, who made these comments about the strikers being in some way collaborating with Putin and the Russians. What's happening, I mean, for example, Zahawi, take a look at him. He's part of something called the Pinay Circle, along with several other ministers or past ministers in the British government, which is this very private, secretive club of far-right former intelligence executives. So the Le Cercle, they call it, is originally started by Pinet, who was a French collaborator with the Nazis in the Second World War. And these people are actually, I think, making policy and making these statements as provocations. And what they're doing is they're saying effectively that we are the enemies not just of Russia, but of our own people, because they must expect, as politicians, that their own people will want to maintain their standards of living. If they don't, then they're at war with their own people. So we're looking at various different crises here in the UK. We've got the climate crisis, where this zero carbon policy is actually making things worse, not better. We're also looking, obviously, we've had the COVID thing recently with the policies there, with the vaccines, in many ways making things worse than they were, so that the cure is worse than the disease. And now this economic crisis with the Russian sanctions massively increasing inflation in Britain and making things worse for the Brits. So you do have to wonder, is this deliberate? All these so-called solutions worse, making things worse? And that's why we've got the strikes, I think, and it's quite clear that even university staff, etc., now going on strike, that these public sector workers are going to maintain their living standards come what may, and the government, really for big business and the World Economic Forum, the globalists, is taking them on in order to try and break the unions. So it's going to be a big battle.
So, Robert, what is your analysis of this big battle that Mr. Gosling just mentioned?
Yes, he's absolutely right. It will get very dirty, I think, going forward, because there seems to be no sign of government backing down on this issue. In fact, the government has basically come out and said, we just can't afford it. We literally can't afford it. We're not going to do it. And in fact, the opposition are complaining that the government is actually refusing to come to the table to talk with some of these union leaders in order to find some kind of compromise. Union bosses are claiming that obviously they have demands which they want met, but right now they would be potentially satisfied in the short term if they at least were to see some meaningful negotiations or some kind of roadmap of negotiations set out by the government, and that's something which they're not receiving right now in many cases, and that's just led to this absolute deadlock that we've seen. So what's going to break? The government historically, the Conservative Party historically, has taken very hardline positions against strikers. Of course, this is referring back to sort of the Margaret Thatcher era and the coal miners' strike, where again she took a very hardline stance, refused to give in to pretty legitimate demands and so on. Could we be going down that road again? That is possible. We have a very difficult economic situation now, a government which is heavily embroiled in a foreign conflict abroad, and of course the government's hands may literally be tied, given the fact that they've had to deal with so many economic crises time and time over, ever since Brexit, the COVID pandemic, and now the situation in Ukraine. So yes, absolutely, things could get very, very worse, and right now there doesn't seem to be any sort of silver lining to what we're seeing going on here.
So, Mr. Gosling, how do you see the future?
Well, I think it really depends if the political classes and the press in the West bite the bullet being who controls the money system. Now, Vincent Vickers, who was the chairman of the enormous great British Empire armaments company that was building ships, all sorts of weapons of all sorts, tanks, this sort of thing, in the run-up to the Second World War. He published a fascinating pamphlet called Economic Tribulation just before he died. And what he was saying is, look, you just simply have to take control of the production of money. You mustn't be spending debt into the economy. You must be spending real government money into the economy. Otherwise, what will happen, as has happened now, and he was predicting it totally correctly, was that the government just simply gets into massive amounts of debt, which ends up meaning that the borrower is servant to the lender, so that the city is basically dictating terms, both on the warfare fronts and on the economic front, and the war that's taking place now against public sector workers. So unless somebody, particularly in the Treasury, decides that we are actually going to take back control of the money system, to start spending money into the economy as real money rather than debt, and turn things around. Unfortunately, what we're going to see is that the financial elite are going to be calling the shots, both in foreign policy and domestic policy. And I would suggest they all should take a good read of Mr. Vickers' economic tribulation paper from 1939, where he spells all these potential problems out, which have come down the line 80 years later.
Thank you very much. Tony Gosling, historian and journalist, joining us live from Bristol, and our very own Robert Carter, live from London. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and views with us on this edition of the News Review. And thanks to all of our viewers for watching this edition.